Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Rowing Chat, the podcast for rowers. I'm Rebecca Caro, and back in 2013, I started the Rowing Chat podcast with a view to interviewing people from all different aspects of the sport. Today, I'm delighted to welcome to Rowing Chat Fergus Hodgson, who is a very unusual man because you live in one country, you come from another country, and you've tried to row for a third. Fergus, what is your background in rowing?
Sure. Oh, well, actually, Rebecca, thanks for having me on. I was a sports nerd as a child, so my background in rowing, I was a runner and an endurance athlete, cyclist, squash player, and the like. And from memory, someone in high school got injured, and there was a room in a quad. So at the end of a season, they basically recruited me to finish off the season with them. And then the coach, knowing my maybe more individualist inclinations in terms of the sport, he said, well, we'll put you in the single next year. And it was a success. And so I really loved it. And then after a year or so out of school, I thought I could get a scholarship to go to the United States. So I competed there at Boston University for 4 years and came back and tried to make the 2008 team.
So context, your home and your place of birth is New Zealand.
Yeah. That's true. Yes. So in terms of my lineage, I was born in New Zealand to a Canadian mother, a Kiwi father, but my Canadian mother's parents are both direct immigrants from Ireland. And so I'm a triple citizen, New Zealand, Canada, Ireland. And I live right now in Utah, the United States.
Wow. You are a truly international man. Now, I'd love to dig into a little bit about your personal background, because you going to America, you must have been one of the very first New Zealand sort of elite schoolboys to get that college rowing experience. How did it come about?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you're right that there was so little knowledge at the time, and I didn't know what to do. And to be frank, Rebecca, I was a little bit out of my depth going into this. So I called on a lot of different people. Basically, the backstory is that I started university at Waikato in Hamilton, and I was just bored with it. I didn't know what I was doing there. It seemed irrelevant to me. And my uncle, a Canadian, had received an athletic scholarship as a runner to compete for Colorado State University. And so my mother said, well, Ferg, your rowing is going great. Why don't we look to see whether we can get you a scholarship to go to the United States? We had no idea. And at that time, as you say, almost no one had tried this out. And also I was from a sheep and cattle farm near Ngaruawahia, right on the way to Wainaro. And that just meant that I really didn't know anything about the United States or the universities there. And I remember, for example, when the Massachusetts Institute of Technology contacted me to recruit me, I had never heard of them. And of course, it's a very prestigious and prominent institution. So I had no idea, because in New Zealand, we had maybe half a dozen state or public universities. And maybe some are slightly more prestigious than others, but they're much of a muchness.
Yeah.
And so there's really a totally different world here in the United States in terms of quality, size, all variety. And so I didn't understand how to handle it. And I actually hired an agent in Australia to walk me through the process, because I didn't know where to start. And once I did that, I received just a flood of offers. And then one of them, Boston University, offered to fly me out for a visit. And in 2002, late 2002, I went for a visit to Boston and to the head of the Charles. And then because it was the big event, there were all these coaches there. So I got to meet a bunch of others. And that helped a lot. But at the same time, if I were to do it again, I'd probably make lots of different decisions about how I handled it, because I was a naive young guy from the hill country.
So what are the scholarship opportunities in your view nowadays?
Oh, they're huge. Yeah.
In the
huge.
context of rowing.
Yeah. So first, the fact is that the United States is a supremely wealthy country with incredible opportunity. Now, rowing is not the most prominent sport, of course. It's a minority sport, but it is practiced by about 20 schools in a serious fashion. And these tend to be at least this is the men's side I'm talking about right now. These tend to be the most prestigious and rigorous universities in the country, because rowing is associated with wealth and history. And so these are the known schools, you know them, University of California, Berkeley, Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, and the like. And Boston University, when I went there, and I think they got about 6 was about their best, is about in the middle of that range. And so there is a peculiar element of US. So in terms of what's the offer, it is tremendous. And I would encourage lots of Kiwis to look into this, because on the one hand, I don't know if there's much debate about the fact that the United States has the best universities in the world, the most competitive higher education market. And I know you have a British accent. The UK has some good schools as well, but the US basically has a very rich higher education sector. And not only is it rich, they have incredible wealth, right? So the endowments some of these universities have are just off the charts. So, for example, when I went to row at Boston University, this is back almost 20 years ago now, the boathouse cost $15 million to build. And in New Zealand, no one spends that kind of money on a boathouse, to be frank. We just don't have that kind of cash to throw around.
And more to the point, that boathouse is a concrete box. It's not an architectural gem. It's just enormous.
Well, the one at Boston University is actually it's a beautiful site. That's another story. But
I've rowed out of it. I know where it is.
Yeah. So it is. There are lots of photos of it, and the university uses it for promotional purposes. But regardless, that was just a little indicator of the wealth, and that was just the start. Just the actual $15 million. That was nothing. And so the wealth available in the United States is often what Kiwis are not familiar with, right? Because we're used to more humble resources. And so first, the university education on offer in the United States, if you are careful, is excellent. Second to none, as far as I'm concerned. And then second, not only is it top quality, but the scholarships available for athletes who are smart and do their homework is that it'll cover basically everything: all your housing, all your food, all your tuition, your medical insurance, the lot. You might need to pay some flights to get there and back, and some petty cash, pay for your cell phone or something like that. But in general, it's very generous. Now, in terms of the women's side, there's actually more opportunity for women than for men, because we've heard of this. Maybe you've heard about the Title IX situation, where the US schools have these huge basketball teams and football teams, and they try to find a women's sport to counteract that, or to balance that out with. And so rowing has become one of those. So with women's rowing, it is an NCAA sport, which means it's regulated differently, and it has more prominence, and more of the state schools, the less prestigious ones, are involved in it heavily in the women's side. So they'll say women's open weight crew, whereas the men's rowing is it's a smaller field. Yeah.
So great opportunity, great education, great money behind it. That's just the start of college opportunities. If someone were to look at doing this today, should they hire an agent like you did?
It's a shortcut if you want to get there. Yeah, especially if you don't have family ties or anything like that, it's not a bad idea, right? Because the agent will help you prepare your profile, your applications, and basically market you to all the schools. Now, you don't have to do that. When I went to Boston University, one of my competitors from back in New Zealand basically tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Ferg, can I come too?" And so I think a year or two later, I can't remember, Joseph Klaassen, he went and rowed for the Netherlands later on in the Olympic 8. I basically assisted him through the process. So you can do it alone, but especially if you're starting from scratch, you can speed up the process a lot by hiring someone to help you. Yes.
Yeah.
And you should know too, because there's a lot of bureaucracy.
Yeah.
I mean, this is somewhere where I think Kiwis would not notice or understand. So for example, when you get there, they'll have some kind of medical check, a swimming test. You're not allowed to compete until you've done a swimming test. We would never care about that back in New Zealand.
What sort of swimming test did you have to do? Like,
I think they need to show that if you fall out of the boat, you're not going to drown. So
it's not a speed test. It's just a survival test.
Yeah, survival test. And so, because obviously the United States is a litigious place with all sorts of lawsuits, so people are trying to protect themselves. And there is a culture shock. Now, I don't recommend. So my key recommendation for going would be the educational element, not to be a better rower.
That's important to know. And contextually now, I know that both Australia and New Zealand have late trials for athletes who are currently studying overseas so that they can also get into the selection for the national team. Now, this wasn't the case when you were in the under-21s. Now, that was 2002. What was the scene as far as you could see it then?
Well, basically, you were away from the program for 4 years. And my roommate, when I first got there, was from Germany, Florian Menningen. He won a gold in, I think, the 2012 8. So he, like me, just took 4 years away from his home country and had basically nothing to do with Germany during that time. And likewise, I barely went back to New Zealand for the entire 4 years. Now, I don't know if there's any easy way around it, because when you're getting a full scholarship, you're basically a professional athlete for the program, and they're going to get their money's worth, right? They want you to prove the quality of their team, and they're not going to be so amenable to you taking time off. And in fact, one of the famous stories is of Zeno Mueller, the prominent single sculler who competed against Rob Waddell. I think he went to Brown, but then got into disputes with the coach because he wanted to compete for his national team. It's a bit like the NBA teams in the United States, where the top players don't bother with the Olympics because they're committed to their professional team.
Yeah.
I don't see any easy way around that. And that's why I say, if people really want to just row, you don't need to go to the United States for that. In fact, and this is where there was a Canadian guy who was coaching back in New Zealand at the time, Richard Parr. I don't know where he is these days.
He's back in Canada.
Okay, well, so he had coached for a while in the United States, and he told me, he gave me a lot of good advice, actually, and he should come on your show one of these days. I'm not sure whether he's already been on it, but he's a smart guy. And he just said to me, that, Fergus, that don't expect the coaching or the conditions or anything like that to be better in the United States than it is at Karapiro. And he was right about that. Yeah. And in general, like I said, after the top 20 or so teams, I would just, if I were on the men's side, just stay away from them.
Particularly if you have ambition to join the New Zealand under-23s or senior team.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
But let's go on to how that's possible nowadays, because being an elite athlete, until you are successful at the moment in most countries around the world, unless the bank of mum and dad is funding you, how on earth can you survive financially? Yeah,
you've touched on the key challenge for a lot of young people, that you put, is it the chicken or the egg, right? So you only really get funding when you've become a world championship finalist, or maybe world championship finalist at the under-23 level these days. And so, but of course, people who make it have already been training for 5 to 10 years, right? So it's a very difficult challenge. And in some ways, looking back now, I'm 38 years old, and I'm a little bit sad about it, because of course I basically moved on from the sport because I wanted to have a career and get started with my own business. And so I take a longer view of it. I would say, if you want to do that, rather than trying to make the team right away or get funding right away, I would actually focus on building a trade or a skill or your own business first, so that you have at least some money coming in. And then even if in your mid-20s, you could come back and compete. Rowing is one of the sports, like, say, marathon running, that you can do into your mid-30s. And so if you can basically build up your own business or a way to get money coming in without, first, before you try to prove yourself as an athlete, that's a smarter way, unless you do have that phenomenal talent that can get you ahead of the game right from the get-go. And I look back and think that there are many, many, many athletes, and I just mentioned before we got started, that who have the talent. And I remember too, when, back my last real competitive race was 2008, and the guy who came second was Chris Harris. He's kept on going. He was actually in the Olympics this year. And I can't remember his last name. My colleague peer at Cambridge Rowing Club was third in the single scull with me. And he had incredible talent, and he just moved on with life because he could not afford to be a full-time athlete, basically. And so I think there's a somewhat simplistic thinking that either we are a full-time athlete or a full-time worker. And I encourage people to get out of that paradigm and say, how can I build a business that, let's say, requires 20 hours of work per week and will pay comfortably my bills, so I can devote the 40 hours a week that I want to my training, and that's a more sustainable model. And then, because we know that to be a top athlete requires 5 to 10 years of training. So once you've established that base, let's say you start when you're 18 or 19 to build up your business, by the time you're 25, you then have 10 years of a window to be an athlete and to perform.
That's such an interesting observation. So I happen to know Brooke Donoghue, who was in the New Zealand women's double scull, got a very nice silver medal at the Olympics. Now, Brooke started a side hustle business selling the Orgo, which is a very neat oar carrying, it's a handle and a templated rack where a coxswain can carry 8 oars together safely without having to have an armful of oars going all over the place. And she sells those online and has been doing that for some time. But I also know that recently she's got noticed and she's been picked up by another international brand to become the local representative for them in New Zealand. And so as a result, you know, you can see a second income stream coming potentially through the same business that she's already set up. Now, she's probably set it up when she was already in the New Zealand team, but the model is quite a good one to follow. And I've started a rowing directory. So if you want to do a rowing related business, if you go to rowing.chat/retailer or just click on directory on the menu, you will find people who've built online businesses, for example, with scrunchies for women athletes or athletes with long hair to hold your hair up at the right tension so that you don't have hair flopping around while you're training. Now, you've probably never had long hair, but trust me, that, you know, that's a problem that's worth solving. It's not going to be a massively successful business earning you gazillions of dollars, but it's certainly going to bring in a bit of revenue that can help you, as you say, while you transition from club through toward the international scene.
Yeah, and I don't know what's going on in Cambridge these days, but when I moved there after high school, I had this desire to make the New Zealand team. A good portion of the athletes were just building boats, right? They were just working in the warehouse, just building boats during the day. Mm-hmm. And I just thought, I hate to say it, and nothing against Kerr's or the boat building factory there, but I didn't think people were building their skills or establishing any kind of long-term income. It was just a day-to-day way to exist. And so that's why, like I said, people, they were just so focused on just rowing all the time, they neglected to focus on their vocational or financial future. And I learned this the hard way, of course, only over a few years. So about, I'm thinking now, 5 years ago, I was successful in building my own business. And now, like I said, I look back and think, man, I love to train. I love this life. But I never could have that. And so when I was competing and trying to make the Olympic team in 2008, I was just suffocated financially and trying to train as much as I could at the same time. And it was just a stressful mix. And I see that all the time. And as I mentioned, when I went with the under-21 team to Australia, we had about 40 athletes, maybe more. And I can only remember one of them who became an Olympian. And my guess is 75% plus of them had the capacity to become Olympians, and they did not.
That's a good point that you make there. I was fortunate to coach briefly Bondi's younger brother, Alistair Bond. And the advice that Hamish gave him was finish your degree first before you try and come to Karapiro and join the elite squad. And that one of his regrets is that he never finished his degree. He went into the elite team maybe 1 year, maybe 2 years too soon. And as you rightly point out, Rowing New Zealand is very interested in you if you show potential at the under 23 level. And showing that potential and being known by them is at least the beginnings of a conversation where nowadays getting your degree is actually more flexible. You don't have to be full-time. Most of the study is modular. And in New Zealand, certainly you can transfer very easily from one university to another. So you can start in Otago and finish at Waikato. It's not a problem, but certainly those things are really worthwhile people considering. The trouble is when you're young and keen, even 25 looks like a really long way in the future, and it's very hard to have that perspective. So hearing your advice is really valuable.
Yeah, and I think too, when you go in full steam without building your financial independence, you can really make rowing just not as fun, basically, because you make it a stressful exercise. But when you're doing it without the stress of your finances, or let's say the other problems in your life, it's so much more enjoyable. And I think it is I still love rowing. I use the rowing machine mainly these days. And I do think that we are fortunate to live in this era where you have that flexibility. As you mentioned, nowadays with education, you don't have to do the conventional approach. And you can start a business while you're young. Nothing's stopping you from doing, as you say, an online business or whatever it may be that can follow you. And also, once you build your business to a certain size, you can delegate. So you can have other people basically making a living for you. And that's just something that I never really thought about or realized when I was straight out of school. But now I see how that's just the smart way to do it.
Now, I want to move on to another area, which is about elite rowing. The big change in the sport, certainly in Great Britain, where I came from, after the 1996 Olympics, at which Great Britain as an entire country only won one gold medal, which was considered to be a national disgrace. Fortunately for us, the medal was in rowing and it was Redgrave and Pinto pair. But the national lottery started shortly after that and became a very major funding source for elite sport. And now the vast majority of Western countries have some form of central government funding, which obviously comes from taxpayer money. You have told me that you've got a view that this dependence on taxpayer funding has really hamstrung rowing as a sport. Tell us more about that.
Well, look, there's so much to say about this, and I feel like all these topics we've touched on, we could just chat about forever, but I'm very aware of the challenges that rowing has, let's say, to remain commercially viable for the future. And we all see the way, for example, that lightweight rowing is basically disappearing, that the sport is having to consolidate. And the short answer is to beg for money from the taxpayer. But the long answer is to actually address how can we make rowing, one, more attractive to sponsors or to viewers, and so how can we make it attractive to sponsors and viewers, and how can we make the sport sustainable without relying on support, which could go away at any time? To be frank, my background is in economics and finance, so I just don't see governments having the cash to keep this going. That we're in there are very difficult problems. We are in this COVID era. And I still remember too, back when I was in Cambridge, my coach, Norm Charlton, with the Cambridge Rowing Club, had mentioned how some of the athletes were not even on government funding, but were actually just on the dole, right? They're collecting unemployment benefit.
Okay.
And he just said at the time that was a tragedy because they were not learning to push their own boat. And so they were not picking up skills or developing long-term, like I said, the long-term financial independence. And so rowing is in a dilemma because, of course, the sporting world is more and more competitive all the time for eyeballs. And I find the evolution of the Olympics a little bit tragic, to be frank. I don't think lots of sports like rugby belong there, whereas rowing is one of these classics. But of course, those sports are coming in because the International Olympic Committee is going for sports that are more entertainment, right, rather than, say, tradition.
Yeah.
And I just know that the dependence on taxpayer funding, while it is a stopgap, it doesn't really address the fundamental challenges that rowing has. And I would like to focus on those. And I know I don't blame anyone for getting this funding or whatever. I just say that this is not forever. And it doesn't help us actually make rowing, let's say, more accessible to spectators, because how many people actually go to Karapiro and watch? I mean, very few. And it seems to have stagnated for the last 20 odd years in that regard. And so, and this is clear also in the United States, because we have college rowing and then it just drops off the map, right?
Yeah, it does.
Because people have to make a living and they have to find a way to make it sustainable. And without colleges basically paying the bills or backing people, they move on with life. And that, like I said, that reflects the fact that we have not found a way to make rowing more commercially viable. And I don't know whether they still do this, but one attempt to do this actually was the Great Race on the Waikato River by Rob Hamill, to try and cultivate this brand that people could understand and relate to. And even though the race was a bit of a charade in that it was on the Waikato River in a very kind of high current area where the race wasn't fair and that it was out of season, the fact is people came up in thousands and watched that.
Yep. It was great fun.
Yeah, Rob Hamill, he actually showed that you can make rowing more appealing to a broader audience if the incentives are right. And I fear that if we just go and hang out at Karapiro making great athletes on the government dime, we're not rectifying that problem.
So televisual attraction, yes, that's one thing. One of the things I've often felt that rowing failed to do, but other sports like cycling have done, is to develop the race format. So things like the Kirin, things like the Madison, these are in their indoor cycling formats. One of them is where you have a lot of different events and a single athlete has to do all of them and accumulates points. The other is a tactical race where you follow a guy on an electric bike round the stadium, and after 3 laps he drops off, and then everybody else is in this sort of mind games thing about how to outwit your competitor, because you can't just blast to the finish. You've got another sort of 5 laps to do. I think that rowing could have looked at a few more different race formats that are much more engaging and provide part of that televisual appeal, but somehow they haven't. Is that a world rowing problem from the top of the sport?
That's a good question, because on some occasions they have. So the Henley is probably the most successful regatta around, right? It's the oldest.
Royal Regatta, yeah.
And how do they sell it? It's a head-to-head race, 2 crews against each other. It's more exciting that way. And then they sell it with this prestige and history and come and have a party on the river with us. And it's great. So who could not want that? So they sell it. People go there. They don't care about the rowing often. They just want to enjoy the sport and have the event. I mean, they just want to enjoy the occasion. And so they've shown there too that that's another model that you can adopt that is successful. And it seems to be growing all the time. I mean, I see it. So I went there, I'm trying to think about 15 years ago, and it seems to be going just as strong now.
Certainly, one of the innovations they've brought in is live streaming onto YouTube. And I'm one of the commentating team that provide the commentary for that. And they've done that not on the cheap at all. It's a very, very sophisticated outdoor broadcast with drones and professional cameras. And it's beautifully done. But it has drawn in a virtual audience, not just of, American mums and dads whose kids are racing there in their college crews, but people like myself. Plus, it also allows them the opportunity to rebroadcast races throughout the entire year. And, who wouldn't spend 8 minutes on, at their coffee break,
I get drawn into these just like you. Yeah, I watch these races too. And there's some good ones. I know is it Borch, the Norwegian sculler, was racing Mahe, and Mahe chased him down. Beautiful race. So a lot of tough events. And so I am optimistic that there can be actually changes to make it more attractive. And like I said, Henley is one example. The other was the Great Race that Rob Hamill did. And I don't know what's going on with it these days or whether it's just over, but he did that back about 15 years ago. And for a while, it was going really well.
He's done a new one, which is called the Waikato 100, where it's any human-powered craft, and you row 100 Ks down to not quite Port Waikato, but you start at Hamilton Rowing Club, Waikato Rowing Club in Hamilton, and they break it into 25K sections, so you can switch crews. And there are people in outdoor outrigger canoes, Wakarama. There are people in kayaks. There are people in rowing boats. there's even a few serious nutters who do it on stand-up paddleboards.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. Well, I've rode down the Waikato a few times, and I don't plan to row 100 kilometers, but.
So, Rob is a man, he's innovating. And there are also people like Andrew Triggs Hodge, who's done an amazing event that I think is called Row London. There are also traditional boat races, which are, getting a resurgence in interest. So there's one that happens also on the Thames where they row, I think it's 40 miles in a day, called what is it called? I'll think of it in a minute. Anyway, but in traditional craft. So again, clinker built boats not with sliding seats and the like. So there are opportunities that are around the physical event and going there and watching. What about the other side of funding? Because, having an endowment as a financial fund to back rowing, many countries have a charitable arm. And I know British Rowing just launched one. They call it Love Rowing, and Kath Bishop is the chair of it. And of course, they're trying to build an endowment fund there. And New Zealand also has the Rowing Foundation, I believe, which is, trying to build an endowment. Is that a pathway that you think was viable?
I'm not so familiar with these endowments, but I think a lot about what people do in distance running. I know distance running has a bigger audience because it's very accessible, but if you look at all the professional athletes in distance running, they have all sorts of brand relationships. They'll be selling, cereal bars and electrolyte drinks, and they're certain type of bike pants or whatever. And they've basically learned how to embed. It's like a whole, like they're like walking marketing strategies. And running itself, it's an endurance sport like rowing, is not particularly outstanding for watching, right? It's not like rugby or American football or something like that. That's very dynamic and there's a lot of violence basically. And so I think rowing can learn a lot from running as well. And like I said, I follow all these top distance runners here in the United States, and they have found all sorts of ways to make it profitable for them. And so that's what I really encourage people to do, right? So to somehow have businesses associated with what they already do as part of their training, and they'll even have businesses where a bunch of, let's say, female athletes will say, we want athletes that fit our bodies better or something like that. We want clothing that fits our bodies better. And they'll start a new brand, and it takes off. So there's a lot of innovation that you can do that follows it. And it is true, of course, like I said, that running is more accessible. But these days, with imported boats from China, I mean, there's more availability to rowing than there has ever been before. More accessibility, I should say.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. So Queen Bee is a brand of rowing clothing that started exactly for the reason that you described. And they use Instagram and influencers. And I think Rowing Bible is another clothing brand. They're all on the rowing directory that I referenced earlier. And, these are great. This is the sort of innovation that the sport needs. It
is great. And I'm not familiar with all of these, but it is suggesting that we may be entering even a renaissance of rowing if we can harness all these innovations together. And that's wonderful. I'm just trying to say that for a long time, of course, we have been dependent on narrow sets of funds. And I think that is not sustainable. And as you said, there are already good ideas coming up to replace that. And the goal would just be to have a deeper and richer, let's say, senior level of rowing competition that more people can participate in sustainably. And even in New Zealand, for example, it's not so much the college system where there's a drop-off, it's after high school. So basically, once people leave high school, because there's not really collegiate or university rowing in New Zealand, people move on with their lives after that. So the school championships will be bigger than the national rowing championships.
That's really true. And I think actually there's an even bigger piece of the puzzle, because although the pathway to elite rowing is well trodden and very well supported nowadays in most countries, there's actually an important thing for the whole of the sport, which is the pathway to non-elite rowing. So the person like me, who's never going to be good enough and strong enough to row for the national team, why and how do you keep someone in the sport as an adult who maybe doesn't want to race? You see, most young people go into a rowing club after school or during university or after university, where the expectation is you'll train 10 to 12 times a week because you want to do 2K racing. There are very few places and clubs which are set up for people who want to row a few times a week and not race. So one of the things that I'm on a mission advocating for, what I call masters rowing, which is basically adults who want to row, some of whom who race and some of whom who don't. And it doesn't really matter what age you are, because in the USA, masters rowing has now been dropped to age 21 as a AA category. So basically, the minute you finish university, if you go on to further study, the minute you finish your club rowing career, so you might leave school, join a club, do 2 or 3 years like that while you're studying, training, starting your career, that actually then there's an opportunity to move forward. And that is a second area where the transition has not been explained well enough. The opportunities aren't there. People don't know the opportunities are there, where they are. And how do we make that part of an accessible pathway for life? Because life is different for everybody. But the fact is, if you choose to have children, there are going to be a few years where you cannot go rowing. You are in full-time childcare mode, or building your own career, your own pathway, your own brand. And I seriously hope that one of the opportunities there is that people in the decision-making part of rowing find that they can look structurally at what are the opportunities, what are the hindrances, what are the things that structurally impair rowing as a sport from being globally accessible. And part of that is boats and equipment. So what if we go to events, which might just be a fun row, it may not be a race, but what if you went to an event where the equipment was provided by the event organizer? Well, that would allow people who don't have the money to join a club or, buy their own equipment. So I think there's actually quite a lot that rowing as a sport can do, not just around managing these transition points, school to university, university to club, club to masters, and so on, but also to enable access to different things like coastal rowing or rowing on a stand-up paddleboard, or, name your favorite. I think there's going to be a lot of development that's possible.
No, well, you're obviously part of this, and that's wonderful, right? You're one of these people who's opening that dialogue. That's great. And of course, one thing is somewhat clear, that if rowing continues exactly the same as it has for the last 50 years, and with the same funding, it will struggle to compete against the proliferation of competing sports, right? So you could say this about many other sports that are dying. Squash is another sport that I played as a young person, and it's really struggling to maintain a profile. And so I am optimistic that there will be changes, and especially now with the dissemination of information that we have not had before. So as I said, I went away to college when I was 19 in the United States, and I knew nothing about what I was getting myself into. Now you can come and listen to us chat about it, whereas YouTube wasn't a thing back then. So.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah. Now, your experience across different countries is unique, and I would love to hear your insights into the New Zealand men's 8 that won a gold at the recent Tokyo Olympics. What really makes them punch above their weight?
Yeah, so it's a really great question, and it's not just the men's 8, but obviously for a long time people have wondered, why is the New Zealand rowing team so solid? I remember, I think it was 2005 when New Zealand maybe won either 3 or 5 world championship titles. And I was in Boston at the time. And of course, New Zealand has about the population of the Boston area. So 4 or 5 million people. And we just thought, how can New Zealand beat these American teams with over 300 million people in terms of the population? And there are many reasons why this is the case. Not that they're easily replicable, right? So a smaller country like Ireland might have an easier time replicating the New Zealand approach whereas someone like Canada would struggle. And so there are lots of conditional factors. So first of all, in New Zealand, we just don't have many prominent sports. So rowing is able to establish itself as one of the major sports in our country, whereas I don't know if it's done that anywhere else on the planet, right? So, and I'm trying to think, every country I know, I remember my college mates from Germany would say that Marcel Hacker, I think maybe won a few world championships in the single, that no one in Germany would know who he was.
Right.
Whereas in New Zealand, we were still remembering the 1972 men's 8 until this year, right? So we were still stuck on this for 50 years, or almost 50 years. And so what gives New Zealand an advantage? First, so yeah, I think there are fewer competing sports. All we really have in summer is cricket. And I hate to say it, I'm not a big cricket man, but rowing seems like it has fewer competitors, and it can have a much more prominent stage in our country. We obviously have great resources in terms of our geography. We have great rivers available for training. The weather that's amenable, much more than say the Canadians have. And the Canadians, for example, when they train out in Victoria, on Vancouver Island, their lake is shorter than 2,000 meters to train on. They're turning around like crazy. So we are incredibly lucky. And even when I trained near Limerick on the River Shannon, we had about, I think, 3.5 kilometers to go up and down. New Zealanders often don't know how lucky they are with their conditions. Also, so we have a more accessible sport in New Zealand. We have a more coherent country too. And maybe this is changing with time. Of course, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, but the New Zealand, there's a stronger sense of a community. And so people will much more put the national team as the priority ahead of their clubs, for example. Whereas in the United States, the national team might be an afterthought, to be frank. Whereas the colleges and the clubs are really where people have their community. Because you can't really have a community between, say, Utah and Boston. You don't know those people. You don't relate to them. So, and that's where, like I said, a place like Ireland would have much more potential to have a coherent or a patriotic team, whereas the United States struggles. And I remember when Mike Tatey, who was the coach of the US 8, and I think many various US teams would say that he would take an 8 to a World Championships, and that they'd only been in about 6 rows together in total. So in New Zealand, we can actually basically get all the athletes to go to Karapiro from the entire country, and they'll all be friends. Basically, they're all very familiar with each other.
I think the media helps as well in New Zealand. The evening news is a 30-minute broadcast.
Yeah.
There's probably a very similar program in every country in the world, and yet in New Zealand, a good 8 to 10 minutes of that broadcast is going to be about sport. So there is prominence given in the media to all sorts of sports. So they will cover the secondary school swimming championships. They will cover non-professional netball, for example, which is the leading sport for women in the country, equivalent to rugby. Although there are lots of women who play rugby, but there are many, many more who play netball. And I think that media-led approach means that people, as you say, become familiar. The name Emma Twigg, the name Mahi Drysdale, the name Rob Waddell, you name Eric Verdonk, all of these people who are single scullers are known individuals to the vast majority of New Zealanders because the country celebrates all forms of sport in a way that is, I think, very different, certainly from Europe, in my experience.
Well, let me speak about Eric Verdonk, actually. He passed away maybe 2 years ago, I'm not sure. And when I was just a young guy, about 20, I just called him up and said, Eric, would you come and watch me train? And we went to, what is the lake up in North Auckland? And he's come and watched Pukaki. Yeah. So he just came and watched me row and said, okay, and gave me a few tips. And I gave him some eggs from our farm in Ngaruawahia. And I just really appreciated him. He was a wonderful athlete. And he had this story. He said to me, he said, Fergus, he had lots of stories to tell me about his time rowing. And he said that lots of times women would say to me, it's either me or rowing. And he said, well, okay, I guess that'll be the end of you then. And, and he said that even though he had missed out on many things in life, he said he had seen so many parts of the world, and he really was pleased with that decision. So he was a splendid athlete, 88, 92 Olympics, and almost got 2 bronze.
Yeah, I went to his funeral, and that almost similar story was told by his wife. She was the one who stuck with him. But your point is really well made, that actually the accessibility of elite coaches and elite rowers in this sport is legendary. And there are very many people, and Nikki Coles, who rowed the pair with Juliet Drysdale, tells a very good story about how an elite rower came to her secondary school, spoke to the whole school at assembly about their experience and how they won a medal. And that's what interested her and motivated her to want to row beyond high school. And I think that even today, if you turned up and went to Carapiro and approached one of the coaches and said, hey, could I come out on the launch with you? They would say yes. And that sort of thing is, yes, geography helps, but also the fact that the expectation is that part of your job as a successful athlete is to encourage the next generation and the generations beyond. And that story I have heard many, many times.
Yeah, actually, Nikki was another old friend of mine back in Cambridge years ago. So she was a fabulous rower in her own right. And there is actually something in New Zealand culture, especially the rural culture, where there is more of a sharing mentality. So openness, as you mentioned. And I tend to agree with you that I remember years ago, I got to know Dick Tonks, and I think Selwyn Cleland just lent me a single scull to go out and row with a few of the national team guys. And like you said, it was very accessible. And also my coaches went and spoke with Rob Waddell and said, would you chat with this young guy? He's just starting, and I just asked him questions about my training, and he was glad to. And like you say, even though they are celebrities, they're still accessible. It's kind of a confusing scenario, but it is the case.
I think the community aspect of what you've described is something that I'm going to stick my neck out here, that the USA lacks. The focus on individualism and the fact that you can be whatever you want to be, and you can be, make the success happen for you. And, everything from self-help books downwards actually means that people are sometimes afraid to ask for help, sometimes afraid to approach people like you described who are already successful, and presume that someone who's already successful won't want to give a hand up to someone who's on their way up or aspirational. And I think that that is a mistake, and that anyone who's listening to this, regardless of where you are in the world, do try reaching out and asking someone who you admire to answer some of your questions. Just like you said, you taking the initiative, you did that because you, Fergus, are smart and insightful, and you thought that it was a good thing to do. Actually, I think we could tell more young people that that's a good thing to do. It doesn't matter if it's career, sport, whatever. Do ask and do offer, because I never had mentors through my career coming through. I've now been asked a few times to mentor other people, and together we make something that's beneficial. And I think that sense of community and drawing that into our own personal career pathway is a really beneficial thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether it's the individualism of the United States, but it is the case that the US is a much more fractured place. There's less, let's say, coherence, because in New Zealand, obviously originally it was mainly Māori and British, and I really feel like we have a great identity in New Zealand with that, and there's a shared sense of history. But also even here, so regarding your point about going out and taking the initiative, even here in the United States, when I was competing, Harvard had the best rowing 8 in the country, and they had a long-time coach, Harry Parker. And I just went up and chatted with him at the Concept 2 or Crash B World Championships. And it was strange, like you said, the way that he was quite glad to just chat with me and discuss the way he prepared his team. And he was known at that time for basically training his athletes less than the other squads, that they would only have one solid training per day so they could focus more on their studies and sleep and eating well, and rather than driving them into the ground.
That's an interesting point, because I had the exact same experience with Dick Tonks. I was sitting watching a regatta at Twizel, which is the photograph behind me, and a man who was next to me, who turned out to be Dick Tonks, I didn't recognize him, turned to me and he said, "Have you spotted any good crews?" And so I said, "Oh, here's this one and this one and this one. And, and he took a note with a pen and paper, and he was there, talent spotting for the pipeline of athletes, obviously, to come into the New Zealand system. And, these people who might have reputations of being grumpy, or, he was always said to be quite monosyllabic.
Somewhat earned, maybe. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Untrue. He was extremely friendly. We had an extremely nice chat. We were both more focused on watching the rowing than chatting, and it suited us both. And so I genuinely think that sometimes just taking your courage, in both hands and going for it could be quite a good thing to do.
Well, I must admit, this is secondhand knowledge, but apparently in the Kiwi Pair book by Bond and what was it, Eric Murray, they wrote that, I think for an entire week, Dick Tonks said one word to them, Epworth or whatever, just told them, go row, 30 kilometers. And that was basically all he said. And he wasn't a man, he was a man of few words. Well, he's still around. He's coaching in Canada, but yeah, I'm trying to think what else to say about him. I remember when I did a few erg tests at the national trials, and my coach, Norm Charlton, had said, no matter how badly you're doing, do not get off the rowing machine.
Right. Don't stop. Yeah.
Yeah. Finish competing or finish your rowing. Even if you do a bad time, do not get off. And one of the top young athletes, Rodney Stevens, who was also a single sculler at that time, he had done that. He had gotten off and puked, basically. So good times for old Rodney. And apparently he was basically just never looked at again as a candidate. And Dick had said, I think he was not involved in that decision. He had said that he actually just disagreed with that he was more open or more forgiving than others might have been towards that.
So to the listener who doesn't know how the New Zealand selection goes, there are independent selectors. Sometimes the coaches are selectors, but often they're not. And when you have to do your 2K test, it's a room with a table behind which are sitting the selectors, one erg in front of it, and you go in on your own, you pull your 2K, and then you walk out again. So it's massively intimidating. It's like an interview plus an erg test plus your selection all in one.
Yeah, exactly. And you're in front of rowing royalty of New Zealand. So guys who've all won medals back in the 70s and 80s, they'll be watching you. And as you said, I don't know why this is the case, but the selectors tend to not be the coaches. I don't know why that is. Yeah.
I think there's a separation there between sort of church and state. It allows I'm sure the coaches have an input into selection, but it allows the decision to be taken out of the coach's hands, so people can't claim favoritism and stuff. So New Zealand and Australia are probably the only big Western countries that still have independent selectors. I think in most of the rest of the world, the coaches, with the board, approve the selection of crews. But yeah, it's interesting. It's a different way of doing things.
Yeah, I don't have any problem with that. I mean, I always thought that New Zealand, I don't think many people complained about there being politics in the selection at all. I thought people pretty much thought the best people got in the crews. Of course, when Rob Waddell in 2008 was having a crack, there was some politics there where I guess Mahe didn't want to have to race Rob. But that was one of the rare instances where it got into the media where people were making, I guess, allegations about each other. But in general, people pretty much accept the results as a meritocratic or fair system.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting? Fergus, it's been a delight having you on Rowing Chat. Please tell the listeners where they can connect with you and what you're up to.
Okay. Yeah. So thank you, Rebecca. And right now, since my business is going great, I'm focusing more on training and my love of sports all over again. And I just started a YouTube channel, which is just Ferg Running, and Twitter, Ferg Running also. And soon I'll have a website. And so basically, I just thought that I would show my capacity to be a competitive athlete as a marathoner. And I'm preparing to do the Utah Valley Marathon next year. And I'm trying to have a crack at the course record, at least for they call it the Clydesdale class. Those over 200 pounds or over 90 kilograms.
Ooh.
And so I'm trying to show people that if you want coaching or support as an athlete, I'm available. And I just would love to learn from people. So I'm just putting it out there that I am making videos about my experience as an athlete. And if people would like to engage with me, I'm more than glad to work with them.
Fergus, it's been a delight having you on Rowing Chat with me. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Rebecca. I really hope your channel keeps on growing and that it is for the benefit of the sport that rowing keeps growing to.
So to all of our listeners, I've been Rebecca Caro. This is yet another edition of Rowing Chat. You can subscribe to receive a weekly email with a link to each podcast we have published in the past week. Go to rowing.chat and you will find the subscribe button there. And for those of you who are listening on any podcast app, please share this with your friends. We would love to broaden our listener base and send us any feedback. It's always good to have ideas for new people who might come on the show with me. Till next time, bye-bye.